just to fix a noise issue. So it's great to be with you, and many thanks to Jamila who sent the invitation first, but also many thanks to the Graduate Gender Program as a whole and to my former colleagues in Utrecht. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to, so I'm going to share my screen because my PowerPoint was a bit too heavy. I hope that doesn't cause any issue. Right, so you should be seeing my PowerPoint. All right. Okay. Everything, you can see everything, I hope. So today I would like to present some of the findings of my monograph, Women and Industry in the Balkans, the Rise and Fall of the Yugoslav Textile Sector, which was published by IB Tauris Bloomsbury in 2019 and which will be out in paperback in 2021, so soon this spring. This monograph is based on over 60 oral history interviews with textile workers across the post-Yugoslav region, as well as on archive and press material produced from 1945 till the present day. The book addresses the process of socialist industrialization and its impact on gender relations, as well as the ways in which women's industrial labor was devalued in the past 2 decades as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia and of post-socialist transformations, which entailed processes of deindustrialization and privatization of textile and garment factories. So just to give you a sense of the transformation that happened in the post-Yugoslav region, this is a picture from one of the factories I visited when I was doing my fieldwork in Osijek. And Croatia, as other post-Yugoslav states, has witnessed an overall devaluation of industrial labor in the last 25 years. In the textile sector, only in Croatia, 100,000 jobs were lost after 1989 and the fall of state socialism. And approximately, we could say that around 400,000 jobs were lost in the post-Yugoslav region as a whole. The bankruptcy and devastation of formerly successful factories, in the insecurity and exploitative character of current working conditions in the garment sector, stand in contrast with the relative job security experienced by many female industrial workers during socialism. Across the post-Yugoslav region and across ethnic identities and nationalities, we know there has been a very bad civil war and conflict there. So across ethnic identities and nationalities, the narratives that textile workers put forward, they're very much similar, and they express a sense of devaluation, anger, loss, and nostalgia for past welfare and labor rights. Former textile workers also suffer a lack of sociability and solidarity fostered by the space of the factory. A number of scholars have underlined the kind of violence of this transition and the trauma caused by economic and social change in the region. And Merce and Ranasinghe have used the concept of de-development to indicate the loss of economic and social capital experienced by countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe during post-socialist transition. They talk in their article of the erosion of development gains in post-socialist countries, which were once characterized by high human development. And you will see that in this presentation, there's a kind of feeling of nostalgia and longing for what is seen as a sort of normal time, which is identified with Yugoslavia. Loss in GDP, growing unemployment, and shrinking welfare services are just some of the factors that were experienced in post-Yugoslav states during the transition. And generally, it's important to understand how workers feel today, but also how their past is informing their current experiences. Working life during socialism is seen by most industrial workers and former industrial workers as a model of normal life, even more so in a post-conflict setting where the economic and social fabric was devastated by warfare in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance. In my book, I argue that in the post-Yugoslav region, we witness a strong persistence of what I call workers' industrial structure of feeling. The industrial structure of feeling that workers interiorized during socialism was based on values such as stability, sacrifice for the future, and intergenerational solidarity, as well as on workers' sense of ownership over their workplace, due to the specific form of market socialism experimented with in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was exiting the socialist bloc quite early on in 1948. And then in the early 50s, it started with this ambitious sort of new way of thinking of market socialist economy as a kind of in-between between West and East. And this idea that the workers were the owners of the factories and the managers of the factories is something that lingers on today. And it's also used to make sense of the present context. The term structure of feeling has been coined by cultural theorist Raymond Williams to indicate a particular quality, I quote, of social experience and relationship, historically distinct from other particular qualities which give a sense of a generation or a period. Williams used the term feeling to indicate meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt, as opposed to more formal definitions such as worldview or ideology. Scholars of labor and industrialization have picked up this term to address the manifold effects of the rise and fall of industrial production. They've emphasized how industrial production created specific structures of feeling for workers and for inhabitants of industrial towns. So not just the workers, but also, for instance, the families of these workers and their children and grandchildren. And how emotions such as loss and dismay emerge when factories cease to produce and when industrial districts decline within a certain neighborhood or a city. And the literature on deindustrialization is growing more and more. And I've been inspired by many deindustrialization scholars who are working on North America and Western Europe, and I've tried to apply such theories to the context of Southeastern Europe in my book. Today, what I'm going to present is in fact the final chapter of the book, which addresses both collective forms of resistance as a result of widespread processes of deindustrialization and privatization, as well as individual workers' everyday resilience through cross-border migration, informal work, and handicrafting, such as sewing and knitting. Throughout this chapter, I also refer to cross-generational exchanges surrounding workers' movement for social justice, namely to a number of cultural and political projects initiated by younger activists who feel emotionally connected to the industrial heritage of the socialist era. In this presentation, I will consider workers' narratives collected in the towns of Pula, Zagreb, and Varaždin. Although my book has a kind of broader post-Yugoslav focus, you can see here a number of locations where I conducted fieldwork. The main amount of oral history interviews that I collected was collected in Croatia because I had a postdoctoral fellowship there at the University of Pula, and that allowed me to do more travel across the region. So Croatia was really one of the main countries in focus, but I also did some fieldwork in Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, south of Serbia, especially, and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is now North Macedonia. So I really try to get an overall sense of textile workers' experiences and memories across the region. Before going into the discussion of the case studies I chose for today, I want to just say something about gender, because I think this is very relevant for the theme of doing gender today. And what I want to say is related to what is called the working mother gender contract that was established during socialism. So, as underlined by a number of scholars, there was a fundamental ambivalence between the official discourses of gender and class equality in socialism and the reality of workers' lives, and especially female workers' lives on the ground. The self-management system empowered workers, but only to a certain extent, and the control over the redistribution of profits was largely in the hands of managers, so male managers, and technocrats. A similar ambivalence between official discourse and reality affected not only class relations, but also gender relations. In line with Marxist theory, Yugoslav authorities saw women's full participation in the labor force as a fundamental way to achieve women's emancipation, and they encouraged women to take part in the labor force. And textile factories were seen as kind of suitable for women, especially after the war, as a kind of female space where women could take part in industrial production while performing a job that was considered as a kind of extension of their natural qualities related to their nimble fingers. And we have to remember that a number of women knew already how to sew and knit, and so it was seen as a kind of extension of the private sphere somehow. Women's reproductive work in the private sphere, however, particularly in motherhood, while it was recognized that it was in need to be socialized in order for women to be able to take part in production, was nonetheless essentialized and attributed to women as their kind of natural role. So there were a number of welfare arrangements, such as extended pay maternity leave, workers' canteens, and childcare facilities, which were supposed to encourage women to take up work. And here you see the Article 24 of the Yugoslav Constitution. We said that women have equal rights with men, also in terms of equal pay. But because of the biological role as mothers, the state is protecting their interest as working mothers and is establishing maternity hospitals, children's home, and day nurseries in order to encourage them to be able to combine productive work with reproductive work. This type of gender regime was very different from the gender regime performed in Western Europe, which was mainly based on the breadwinner model of the man going out of the house and working and earning a family wage, let's say, and women staying at home and being a housewife. If we take the example, for instance, of Ireland, where I'm located now, in the Irish constitution, there is we could say an opposite article to this one from the Yugoslav constitution, which says that actually women shouldn't be forced to go out and work, to go out of the house and work, but they should be encouraged to stay at home and nourish the home, which is kind of the basic unit of society. So very different gender regime there between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, especially Catholic countries like Italy or Ireland. But also the US. I mean, the breadwinner model was also very central to the Cold War United States. So this working mother gender contract has been studied by a number of scholars who have argued that socialist welfare provisions did not resolve gender inequalities inside the home, and that women continue to be the ones taking care of domestic work, leading to the well-known phenomenon of the double burden typical of socialism. Women also tended to be less educated than men, and to be concentrated in less profitable light industries and in blue-collar positions, according to the persistent gender division of labor, which was also there in socialist states. However, it would be reductive to only consider women as alienated victims of socialist policies and of emancipation from above. After 1945, as a result of industrialization, women took part in education and in the labor force in unprecedented ways in Yugoslavia, with employment rates scoring approximately 33 to 38% on average, but with significant differences between the most developed and less developed republics. Working outside the home became an important part of women's everyday life in the most industrialized regions of Yugoslavia, and factories often became a second home, with industrial work allowing women to access wages, social insurance, healthcare, cheap housing, and subsidized holidays. Susan Woodward, she said that during socialism, the employment status, I quote, defined the identities, economic interests, social status, and political loyalty of Yugoslav citizens. One's place of work was the center of one's social universe. As industrial workers, women were partaking in the socialist discourses and practices that turned each factor into a center of community life and gained job security, social mobility, and personal empowerment to various degrees. And this kind of confirms what Frances Pine found out for Polish seamstresses during socialism. She said that in their work relations and activities in the state sector, women were able to realize a kind of individual value which transcended without excluding the prescriptions of kinship and gender located in the domestic domain. And that was also because, let's say, these domestic duties were sort of recognized by the state. And so women could kind of get out of their productive roles when the family needed to have more attention, or when there was something that, like a sick child or an elderly relative that needed to be taken care of. So it was allowed for women to have a sort of a buffer related to their reproductive roles. The over 60 oral history interviews I collected across the region make evident the importance of class and gender in shaping industrial workers' attachment to the space of the factory. Beyond ethnic and national belonging, working class women across the post-Yugoslav region share very similar narratives on their work experience. So let me start with now with the Kamensko workers and the hunger strike in Zagreb. The Kamensko workers and their hunger strike in 2010 are certainly one of the most covered events in the media in the recent years. The Kamensko factory was founded in 1943 during the war, and then it was moved to Zagreb in the post-war period, and it oriented its production towards the international market, namely Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. The employees grew to almost 1,000, and new plants were built in underdeveloped villages in various different regions. In the early 60s, the factory was equipped with a holiday resort on the Adriatic coast, as well as with a canteen and the provision of social housing for workers. During late socialism, Kamensko employed 2,600 workers in its Zagreb plant, plus others in smaller towns, and it exported mainly to Western Europe. So in 1993, the factory was privatized through the shareholder system and continued to produce outsourced garments for Western Europe. And that's what happens with many of these factories. In the 90s, they were privatized through this shareholder system, and they continue to export mainly to Western Europe. However, as in other similar cases, when the sale of factory shares to outsiders was permitted, one of the directors started to sell his share on the market, and construction companies bought most of the shares because the Kamensko building was in a relatively attractive area of the capital city, Zagreb. And so the local oligarchy started to do this shady investment in the factory, and that's something that happened. This is a kind of a common story of each of these factories. Like things started to go bad. Nobody knew who was responsible anymore for what was happening, and the factory started to accumulate losses. And in 2009, as a result of the privatization, wages started to be delayed for the remaining 400 workers, and sometimes they would receive a wage so that they wouldn't go on strike. But after 7 months of not receiving a wage, in September 2010, a group of 20 of them decided to go on a hunger strike in the park across the factory, sleeping in the park at night and going to work during the day. Despite the lack of union support, workers received support from civil society activists and students and significant media coverage. And this fight sort of intersected with wider social movements for right to the city mobilization and against privatization of the public space in the city. However, in their narratives, workers still felt quite isolated and at loss during the hunger strike. The narratives relate the existential watershed represented by the closure of the factory. This is something that all workers would express, this kind of disbelief that the factory could close. Such a successful factory, it was going so well. I couldn't believe this would happen. I thought my factory would keep going and would resist across the years. So among those who joined the hunger strike, there was Angela, an upbeat and witty woman in her 50s, married with 2 children, who later found a precarious job in the public sector, and later was again unemployed. Angela started working in the factory in 1981 when she was 18 years old. And with her usual irony, she said, when comparing the past and present conditions, the following. At that time, which they tell us was Tito's dark time and so on, you had more rights than today. Young workers could not work at night or for too many hours, and they had more holidays. There were more and better rights than nowadays. Today, they pay 8 hours and you work 10 hours. Before overtime got paid, now you can work from morning until the next day and you won't get paid. This is democracy, while before it was terrorism. And of course, she laughed because she was making some kind of sarcasm about the current stigmatization of the socialist system in public discourse in places like Croatia. As a positive element of socialism, Angela also remembered the rich social life of the factory, such as the parties they had there, the catwalks when the new collection would be presented, and so on. She said also that she started to like this popular music, which was not her musical choice, but she was listening to that at this factory party. She said, I was a hippie. I listened to Janis Joplin, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple, and then they were playing traditional songs. After a while, they would get into your ear. In the 90s, she bought shares of the factory up to 4,000 euros, thinking that that would help for the factory not to fall in other people's hands and to keep in this kind of, so to say, let's say, like and to stay within the workers' kind of control. When the wages started to get delayed and stopped, she went on strike, and then she said it was great about the strike. She said it was great. I lost 3 kilos. It was the only great thing. Eventually, the hunger strike was followed by a production strike in which all the workers were involved, and the process of bankruptcy started in October 2010. And at that point, the factory starts to be like the whole bankruptcy process is a kind of bureaucratic process. So after the factory was formally bankrupt, the workers started to get some kind of social wage from the state. But still, they lost a number of wages and they haven't been yet fully compensated. In the interview, Angela recalled the trauma and difficulties of the last month, in which many workers were struggling to survive without a wage, especially those who were single mothers and had to pay a rent. At a certain point, after seeing her colleagues in such a critical situation, she had a nervous breakdown, she said, and she was prescribed antidepressant and sleeping pills. Eventually, however, she decided to do without them. And again, she was very ironic. She said, I didn't do drugs when I was young. I won't start now. Despite these difficult memories, Angela kept taking part in all activist initiatives concerning Kamensko, including theater shows and documentaries, which are usual irony and wittiness. Another very proud and resilient figure of the Kamensko struggle is Radha, the president of the new Kamensko cooperative founded by the former workers after the bankruptcy. She's a widow and a mother of two, and she managed to find another job in the public sector after the bankruptcy until she went on retirement. And after being retired, she founded this cooperative, which sort of helped women to bridge this gap years between their unemployment and the years that they needed to get a proper pension. They organized periodical sewing classes and educational activities with various volunteers, and her kind of duty, she felt this kind of duty towards other colleagues who were less fortunate than her, who didn't manage to get a job after the factory went bankrupt. And she told me that for a long time she dreamt of a former colleague who was alone and hungry during the final stages of the bankruptcy, and in the end who got a stroke and died because of the stress created by this criminal privatization process. Radha saw the cooperative as a way to help other people and other women especially, and she had this narrative that was always about pride and dignity, and how even in the worst time of the strike, she would not let her dignity be taken away. She said we kept our head up and we kept going, and we didn't let other people put us in a small place. And herself, she always wore makeup and had this kind of blonde fashionable hairdo, and she never gave up on her feminine appearance, even during the worst time of the strike. And even bystanders and colleagues commented upon her outlook, which appeared too ladylike for a garment worker on the brink of poverty. She told me that she resisted those who wanted to put her down, also when it came to appearance. She said, I always had my head up, always with makeup and always proud. Every woman has some makeup on the side that can last. I also told it to my kids who do not like makeup. Everyone has something in life. I have that. I like when a woman takes care of herself, and even in the hardest of moments, no one has to notice. You are the only one to know. It really fascinated some people that we are proud and we are not allowing others to make our curb our head. So this purpose of looking like a real woman and maintaining a representative image certainly helped Radha to express her agency in times of crisis and to maintain good public relations and network in a society in which middle-aged working-class women are more and more discriminated on the basis of their appearance. I see that the time is going quite fast, so I'm kind of summarizing a few things. But there was a case in which she said that she sent a colleague of her to a job interview, and the owner sent her away because she didn't look like good enough. And then she was really annoyed and went to this person and said, would you be happy if somebody would do the same to your mother or to your sister? And she reminded him that working skills go beyond external appearance and that women's worth has no expiration date, she said. So while Angela's resilience greatly rested on her ironic attitude, Radha built her resilience strategy around her personal idea of working class pride. And despite their experiences of victimization and loss and unemployment, Angela, Radha, and the other Kamensko workers refused to be casted in a victim position. And this Kamensko hunger strike sort of became a symbol of workers' resistance. And it has been taken up in a number of theater productions in which workers themselves were acting. These are not just a few names of this theater production: Unbreakable Threads, Project of a Multi-Annual Apple Plantation, and Starving Female Workers. And then there was this other music video by this very popular Croatian band, Hladno Pivo, which is called Firma, or company. And here the Kamensko workers, you can see on the bottom left, they are appearing next to pictures of sewing machines, and they have this posters and cards which say 7 months without a pay and without a wage, and they kind of recollecting a bit the history of the factory, and they're portrayed alongside other male workers who have lost their jobs in other sectors, such as the petrochemical and metal industry. From a gender perspective, the industrialization also very much affected male workers, particularly in heavy industry, but also in textile. The few male workers that I interviewed were textile workers, sometimes more in the middle manager or more kind of in between positions, not as blue collar workers. They were also having the same feelings of nostalgia for the past, and especially for the labor rights that existed in the past. How am I doing with time? Because I'm not sure, we started a bit later. How much do I have?
It is, what's the time? I'm glued to your lips, so I don't keep track on time. I think still, well, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Yeah.
So another place that was witnessing workers' mobilization against factory closure was the eastern town of Pula, the border with Italy, on the seaside. And that's where the Arena Knitwear factory was founded in 1947. The factory was initially named after Olga Ban, a young partisan woman killed by the Nazi forces and fascist forces, and then it was renamed Arena in the 60s. Arena employed, let's say, on average 700 to 800 workers in the 70s and 80s, and it was privatized in the 90s, and it went bankrupt since 2014. Arena was so together with the Astra shoe factory nearby, the Olga Ban, or later Arena factory, employed mostly women from the town and from the surrounding villages, and especially the so-called social cases, such as widows and single mothers, and women who had children outside their wedding. Arena had an internal bank. So in the 60s, with the market reforms, they decided to have their own internal bank. So workers would deposit most of their salaries in the internal bank, and the money from the internal bank would be reinvested into the factory to expand the factory and to keep it going. And so Arena from the 70s was equipped with a modern canteen, a factory clinic, as well as a gynecological, orthopedic, dental, and oculistic clinics. And it was kind of this kind of socialist microcosm, and it resembles many other factories, textile factories in the region that had all these welfare services attached to it. The innovative creations of Arena fashion designer Maria Varesco led to several prizes being awarded to Arena at different fashion fairs in Yugoslavia. Arena exported high-quality knitwear to the West, the Eastern Bloc, and non-aligned countries such as Libya, Iran, and Iraq. Despite the usual difficulties in combining productive and reproductive work, all the Arena workers fondly remember the social standards and the sense of community experience within the factory. Ines, a blue-collar worker, had this narrative when we had the interview with her. Once she was talking to a relative and former colleague, and she told her that she missed the factory after retirement. And the relative said, "Aren't you crazy? Aren't you happy to be at home and to just do your life?" And she said, "It's nice at home, but it was nicer when I would get ready in the morning, take the bus or get a lift from my husband and go to work. It was how it was, but we worked, we were young, we sang, we had fun, and so on. There was a party once in a while. We would bring something, treat ourselves. During the night shift, for the whole night shift, you work and work, but you also sing. Not because you're happy, dear God, but like that, together with others. You were also somehow happy, weren't you?" So this quote is indicative of this ambivalence. On the one hand, the textile workers, they felt that they were doing a very intensive job and that they were not paid much for what they were doing. At the same time, there was a sort of overall social recognition for the work they were doing at the level of discourse in socialist Yugoslavia, but also the level of practice in terms of the welfare services they could access. And what they also felt was that the factory floor was a space that allowed class and gender sociability and solidarity. And most of them evoked the good working atmosphere that was present at Arena. Another worker, she said, "In fact, we were like one family. If somebody had something bad will happen to somebody, God forbid, everyone would collect money." And she recounted a solidarity initiative that was done by all the workers in favor of a woman who had a baby outside their marriage, and how they all collected items in a minivan and brought it to the village, and how everybody started crying when they came there and gave these items to the new mom. And the sense of community was something that persisted also after the bankruptcy. And that's something that really stayed with the workers. And a similar story to the one of Kamensko. After 8 months without a wage, the workers went on strike to at least get this unemployment recognition and get some social welfare payment. And the sad thing about Arena is also that many workers lost their savings because of the internal bank, because they put this money in the internal bank thinking it will help their own factory. And actually, at the end, all the savings were lost. So what I found was that the ones who had lost their jobs and their savings were much more bitter than those who had already retired when the factory went bankrupt. And when I came to Pula, it was just after the bankruptcy was proclaimed and the factory was still open. As you can see here, it was possible to visit, and things were being sold. So they were selling everything in the factory, from tables to anything you could find in there. And so one woman who was there overlooking the sales, she said, after all these years, I feel like, how shall I say, as if we had no value here, as if we gave nothing to the company. But we gave our maximum, not just us, also the women who came before. We continued their work. That's why when I look at the machines and at what's on sale, so little money is being asked for it, and we, how shall I put it, earn it with our blood for the factory to get to this point. So again, the structure of feeling that was developed during socialism about workers sacrificing for the future and helping other generations to grow, it was kind of cut short by the bankruptcy. And here is another example of solidarity with the workers. This was a demonstration that took place on the 8th of March 2014, and it was called A Catwalk on Strike. So what happened is that there was a singing and there was this red carpet, and then the workers would do a catwalk with the production from their own factory, because these clothes that were done by the Arena Knitwear factory were considered as super high quality in Pula. And all the women I talked to, even those who were not workers, they were like remembering how this production was really appreciated by local people. So in a symbolic demonstration of attachment to the factory, the participants wore Arena garments and engaged in this last catwalk. And during the catwalk, Pula photographer, activist, and singer Edna Jurcan sang the traditional Italian folk song La Lega, a song of struggle used among the female rice growers of the Po Valley, and which can also be seen in Bertolucci's famous movie Novecento, which is stating, although we're women, we're not afraid. For the love of our children, we join the union. So it's a classic working class song that has been sung by activists in Pula. And after this, a choir was created, an activist choir, which performs around Croatia in support of various protests and alternative events. I think I have to go a bit faster here. There was another story that I found very interesting in terms of survival strategy. So like one part of the chapter is talking about how workers are putting in place a number of survival strategy after unemployment. So some of them are informal work, so all sorts of smuggling and informal work. Another strategy is the migration to Western countries for care work, especially in places like Pula, which are close to Italy, where there is a flourishing market for elderly carers. They also put in place seasonal work, like they engage in tourism. In Croatia, it's possible to engage in tourism, not so much in other post-Yugoslav state. They also did handicrafting. So one story came from this woman in Varaždin, and she told me how she had started to engage in informal trade after privatization. So she was going to Zagreb and Austria, and she would resell the clothes to her colleagues, and she would also have a subsistence garden in her house, just to make some fruit and vegetables with her son in order to survive. And the interesting story is that she was the one, with other colleagues, she was the one who sewed this enormous Croatian flag that was raised after the war in these reconquered territories in Knin. And here we see President Tudjman in the town of Knin in 1995. And this immense Croatian flag had been created thanks to Marina, the seamstress, and other ones. And And it was far from the gleam of international and local media. It was low-paid and exploited work, and that wasn't really in the highlight. But she told me the story how she was creating this Croatian flag, and also her partner, who had been a blue-collar worker as well in the garment factory, said, when I had to get an apartment from the factory, so it was on the list to get an apartment, then came 1991, and there went the apartment. The apartment went, and I went to Slavonia to fight in the war. So there was really this sense of the end of work and the end of the factory coincided as well with this period of war and chaos somehow in places like Croatia. And other workers were talking about how they were surviving by taking advantage of their sewing and knitting skills, which came in handy after post-socialist transformation. For instance, there was Zorica. She used to be a supervisor in the knitting department at Arena. Her parents were also part of the management in the factory, so she was kind of connected to this socialist management during the socialist era, and she was very attached to the factory and to its values. And she left the job at Arena when wages started to be delayed because she couldn't stand the sight of other workers being depressed and sad and ill and so on. And so she said that knitting and sewing became her survival strategy. She said, I always knitted. My dad was knitting and my mom as well. We always had some machine at home for knitting. And I was always sewing something. I do everything by myself, bags and clothes, all on my own. And concerning the food, we will get by. I won't get hungry. There in the factory, I would have got angry and nervous. I got sick precisely from that nervousness. I'm not the person who can look at someone else suffering when there is no solution. If it doesn't go, it doesn't go. Cross it, turn a page. Let's go further. So this was just one of her narratives, and she displayed her knitter creations at the market in Pula, from sweaters to bags to slippers, and she was taking part in different fairs, which were kind of giving her an outlet to show her skills and to get appreciation for her work. And other workers were selling their knitting and weaving artifacts in the market. So these examples give an idea of how former seamstresses mobilized their existing skills in the post-socialist context, thanks to the resilience habits formed during the socialist era, which taught women to be strenuous workers, both in the productive and in the reproductive sphere. On the basis of such skills, working-class women across the post-Yugoslav space put in place a wide array of survival and resilience strategies that allow them to cope with increasingly uncertain labor markets, very low pensions. We have to think that the pension, even when they get to pension, is around 200 euros, and shrinking welfare states. And again, this very much depended on where they were located. In Croatia and in places like Pula near Italy, they had much more opportunities for informal work or care work than in places like Bosnia-Herzegovina or North Macedonia. To conclude, this overview of practices of collective organizing and individual resilience strategies highlights working-class women's attachment to a world in which labor, and especially manual labor, was seen as a source of dignity, respect, and deservingness. In his critique of the scholarly literature on post-Fordism and the end of work, Tim Strangelman contested the depiction of industrial workers as an alienated group, as alienated victims of global capitalism. Instead, he suggested to consider the ways in which work, I quote, still provides structure and meaning in people's lives, however imperfectly this may occur. One only has to look at the obverse of people without work to see the reality of this. Through informal work and through new income-generating activities, working-class women in the post-Yugoslav state attempted to replace the structure and meaning provided by factory work during socialism. Socialism is remembered as a period in which female workers' individual and collective contribution was valorized through job security and welfare rights, despite low wages, intensive working rhythms, and daily skepticism towards political decisions. In contrast, the present post-socialist era is read as one characterized by precariousness, injustice, and growing social inequalities. Industrial workers' conception of work as a source of dignity, meaning, and value, both individual and collective, is part of the industrial structure feeling interiorized within garment factories, which lingers on to these days as a form of experiential consciousness through which they read contemporary post-socialist society and its injustices. Often depicted in popular culture as the victims or the losers of transition, Angela, Radha, and the others should be seen simultaneously as everyday survivors and fighters for a better world based on the universal principles of social justice and dignified labor for all. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go too fast.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for this absolutely fascinating account of the way in which women take care of themselves, the way in which they show agency, resilience, respect, the way in which they try to survive systems which are more or less built on their exclusion and their neglect. So I think this was a really inspiring case study, which gives flesh to a lot of structures which we all study, as you know, in the program. And particularly, I think that some of us are working especially on how the capitalist or neoliberalism creates precariousness and injustices and don't do what they promise to do, which is creating democratic and inclusive societies. Very nice also to see how the arts play a role in these new circumstances, and how much this genealogy of community which has been built under socialist structures is be of help also in the post-structuralist world. So this idea of how to organize yourself is also deployed under new circumstances, which I find very interesting also. I'm absolutely sure there are a lot of questions, either for clarification, because that's mainly how we work. We first do a round of clarification, a round of questions of clarifications. Is there anything which the audience would like to hear a little bit more about? It was a lot, of course, and it went maybe also relatively fast. So that's what I would suggest, to first open a round for anybody who would like to have a little bit more of clarification in the use of concepts or examples. And if that is taken care of, we open the floor to have further interaction with you on whatever topic comes up. I would invite whoever who wants to speak to turn on the camera and to mention your name and function so that Chiara knows to whom she is speaking. Shall we work by raising hands? And do I see it then? Participants, Yamila.
Yes, hi Chiara, so nice to see you again after so long. I mean, I really appreciate the whole presentation. I have a question, basically, I mean, mostly question of clarification, because I'm really curious, like I follow it as a sort of, yeah, you know, like this whole narrative. So one first question, it's really about the notion of de-development that you use at the beginning. I'm not sure what exactly it means. I mean, I think it was mentioned in the first slide, and you were, maybe yourself, you were portraying or describing the current situation as a situation of de-development, like the crisis that post-Yugoslavia is facing in terms of industrial crisis or employment crisis, criminal privatization crisis, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, how could you define this concept? Concerning this story of all these women, and especially the one from the Kamensko factory, I was wondering whether there was any specific role of trade unions or any political organization, if it was just a sort of spontaneous and autonomous movement. And maybe another, well, maybe it's a bit banal, but I'm wondering, so the feeling is that you're, it's very clear, I mean, from what these women say, that there is a sort of, not necessarily a naive nostalgia about the past, but the awareness that some rights that existed back then are now denied. And then there is the feeling that, well, the present sucks, maybe a present that has been much hoped for or much waited for, that it's actually yeah, quite deceptive. I'm wondering if there's any political ideals, any project that can be projected toward the future, starting from that. In the way, I mean, beside the fact that they are fighting, they're resisting, they're leading their own struggles here and now, how does it shape a certain vision of the future or possibility for the future? Not necessarily, I mean, in ideological terms, but in general, how this dialectic between the present that sucks, so to say, and the past that somehow was better, shape their vision of the future, of what kind of political perspective do they give themselves. Thanks, Chiara.
Perfect, thank you, Jamila. Nice to see you. Shall I start with this one then? Yeah. So yeah, just to indeed, I mean, this nostalgia that is being singled out in the book is not naive. It's following other authors who have been working on Yugo nostalgia or other forms of nostalgia in Eastern Europe. It's this reflexive nostalgia. So it's something related to certain rights that were there in the past, but it's not something just a simple longing or naive longing for the past. It's about knowing that labor and especially industrial labor was valued in a different way in the past, and especially like industrial labor, but also labor in general. Like there is really this idea that labor rights have gone completely lost in the new capitalist environment, and also because the transition was so brutal in places like the former Yugoslavia. They really felt like this transition was ruthless and brutal, and sometimes there is this kind of how to say ambivalent representation of the capitalism in the West as being still kind of more welfare oriented than in places like Southeastern Europe. So there is this kind of vision also of that when capitalism came here, and it was done in the wrong way. So it's this idea of criminal privatization and like wild capitalism somehow that's starting. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't a critique of the socialist system in the interviews. I mean, there was often this critique of gender and class hierarchies, and especially this critique of political decision making in the factory and how it was privileging the managerial elite. That was something that came up many times. When it comes to a new project, I mean, in places like Croatia, there are a number of new political parties and social movements that are connected to this whole project of reclaiming the city and reappropriating public space. And there is this new party called Možemo, or We Can, that is quite strong in the city at the moment. So there are all these new projects done by this generation, which is often the generation of people who came of age during the transition. So people who will be in their 40s and 50s who have experience of socialism maybe in their childhood, and who kind of grew up in the 90s and are now sort of coming back to a certain values of community and also this reclaiming of public space and public rights, civil rights, which go beyond the ethnic belonging and ethnicity somehow. When it comes to trade union in the Kamensko story, in the Kamensko story, the trade union wasn't really positive. They really didn't encourage the workers, so they were very skeptical about the trade union, and that's something that has happened quite a bit when it comes to textile workers, because already, let's say, the trade unions were sort of, during the socialist era, they were part of the state, so they were seen as part of the managerial bureaucratic structures within the factories. But also afterwards, after transition, the trade unions were very much weakened by transition, and the textile sector is a very weak one when it comes to unionization, especially in these new companies that are often forbidding workers to join the union. So there's a lot of blackmailing of workers, and workers are being threatened if they join the union or if they show certain organizing. So in the case of Kamensko, the trade union was against the protest, and so they were quite skeptical about the whole trade union. But there have been other cases in which the trade union were a bit more supportive, and yeah, but generally the trade union haven't prominently featured in the struggles from what I could hear. And when it comes to development, yeah, that I found an interesting concept, in the sense that among not just among textile workers, but among citizens in general, there is this feeling of having lost a number of gains that were built during socialism in terms of education, employment, healthcare, all these rights to the commons that were built, like the right to public healthcare, the right to free education, the right to social housing, and a number of these were lost or were kind of severely deteriorated. I mean, in a number of places there are still welfare services in place, such as maternity leaves. For instance, Croatia has one of the longest maternity leaves in Europe, and this is kind of a legacy of the social system. But there is this sense of having lost social and economic gains in the process of transition, also due to the war and to this kind of chaos that ensued after the war, and displacement and people migrating as well. Now we have to think that the post-Yugoslav region most recently is also having one of the biggest migration to Western Europe, or to places like Ireland. Like half of Croatia is now in Ireland, especially from this area in Slavonia where there are no jobs, and young people really feel that they lack opportunities. Many of them are now leaving. So, and especially in places like also Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are thousands of citizens, they're leaving every year. So there is really this feeling of towns emptying out, job places not being there anymore, sort of a kind of economic and social decay, we could say, and urban decay as well.
Rosemary, can I just add something, maybe because I didn't make myself clear? One thing I wanted to mention, do the word socialism and capitalism, when I was speaking about the ideological, political horizon, matter? In the sense, do they define themselves, I mean, women in struggle, as anti-capitalist? Do they define themselves as something in relation to socialism? What kind of words, what kind of terms define their political and social positioning up to date?
Yeah, I think in those cases it was mainly they would identify as workers. They wouldn't take specific ideological positioning there. It wouldn't be, also because it's very stigmatized. So a number of people, that was a joke I was making when I was writing the book. Like the famous formula, I'm not racist, but like a number of people would be like, I'm not nostalgic, but. And then they would say a number of nice things that happened in the past, but they were really making clear that they didn't want to be seen as nostalgic for Yugoslavia, because that's very stigmatized in places like Croatia, for instance.
Thanks a lot, Chiara, for this enlightening answer. Any other questions for clarification? If not, then the floor is open for any topic you would like to raise.
Ines has a question.
Ines has a question. Hi, Ines.
Hello. Yes, I'm Croatian, so it's really nice to see such a case study. And I was also researching in this path, like Yugoslavia, and women going from private to public and giving them opportunity to work. But mainly they were not on high positions, like they were creating community in like these small factories. But do you consider that these communities of these kind of women are now perpetuating the role as a woman, as submissive, or as not one fighting for her rights, or raising their children or their daughters to be more independent? Or I'm just wondering, how does this situation reflect on younger generations? And of course, there's always bad sides and good sides. They created an amazing community, but I'm just wondering, what's your view on how does these communities affect future generations?
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting question. There has been quite a bit of literature, I think, on this issue of intergenerational transmission, both when it comes to the memory of socialism and also the war and its aftermath. And I think we should be careful not to generalize, because as I said, it really very much depends on the location or the place we're talking about. Like every city or every region or every republic, former republic, would have a different story, also in relation to how much it was affected by the war or not. But what I found when I was looking, because I was looking for people interested in this topic, I found a number of young activists who were really trying to valorize this memory of the labor of their mothers, grandmothers, elderly relatives. And that's something that I found very interesting, that whenever I was talk to a young person from the former Yugoslavia, often they would tell me, oh, but my mom used to work in a textile factory. Oh, my aunt used to work in a textile factory. So this textile factory heritage was really something that was widespread, but at the same time, each factory will have its own story, so to say. But this interest for a different system, that was kind of valorizing labor, because also a number of people today are facing this issue of unemployment, and they're facing this issue of precarity. So they're really interested in this in another form of let's say social ownership, or another kind of vision of the commons. And I was happy that in places like North Macedonia as well, there are new activist groups that are coming up. Like I did my research in Stip in 2013, and there was nothing. I mean, I didn't know of anything much happening there. And then now there is a new cultural center which is helping textile workers to reclaim their rights, and it's led by Kristina Ampeva, who used to be a textile worker and is now a cultural activist who's helping their workers. So I found that this was really great, that to see that there has been, in the space of a few years, something coming up there in terms of young people's activism. But yeah, that we have to think also this is very much related to urban areas, and we have to see also in smaller places, maybe that is not the same story. So again, I wouldn't generalize it, but there were certainly new social movements and new activist groups coming up then. Jim, you have a question?
Ciao, Chiara.
Ciao.
Thank you for the lecture. It was very fascinating. I wanted to ask you something about the notion of structural feeling. I don't know how central is it to your actual work, but because you mentioned it now in the lecture, right? So perhaps, first of all, if you can say something more about what it is and how can it help you conceptualize or understand this research? But more specifically, I was wondering, how do you actually come to define a structure of feeling? I mean, we know that you did oral histories, but of course, people's memories in general are never self-evident. So how do you come to reconstruct a structure of feeling? And especially because you said, I mean, one of your arguments was the structure of feeling built under socialism somehow survived the brutal neoliberal transition and helps explain, partly at least, the impact of this transition on these workers. But of course, so I was wondering, to what extent actually can you access that structure of feeling, because that transition taints already through nostalgia or through tabooization almost of the socialist past, in many different ways. People might, the memory even of those feelings, and feelings are always something fleeting in themselves, right? So, but the memory of those feelings through such a brutal transition, politically, economically, etc., can be very tainted. So how do you reconstruct that socialist structure of feeling somehow?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's not easy to answer, but I will try. So the structure of feeling, as I said, is something that was coined by Raymond Williams to talk about this kind of generational, experiential mode that can be attributed to a certain context or a certain spatio-temporal moment. And that's something that has been taken up by a number of scholars of the industrialization, who say that during industrialization, first of all, certain structures were put in place, right? So the life of certain community in industrial settings was shaped in a certain way by work. You can think of the work shifts. You know, the textile workers were having these 3 work shifts, and then they will get out, or you know, there was this kind of routine related to the workplace. But also in the case of Yugoslavia, because the factory was this socialist microcosm to which other welfare services were attached. It created a certain site for sociability and certain habits. We can think of cultural groups, we can think of sports groups connected to factory life. So factory life really determined to a large extent the life of especially towns and cities when the factory, often we have to think that these factories were like the main factory in a certain town. So most people would be working in a certain town, like in the town of Novi, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I did some research. This was kind of the main textile factory. So most of the women were working in that factory, in that town. So definitely that created a certain structural feeling for a specific place, and how to reconstruct it. That's something that's not easy. And I got some book reviews in the meantime, and so people were like, you didn't define the structural feeling precisely enough. And that's probably true. I mean, because it's, as you say, it's very difficult to pinpoint or to define it in a way that's respectful of people's narratives. But what I found is that a number of these narratives that were interiorized during socialism, like the self-sacrifice narrative, but also this narrative of women as being able to do it all. So women doing and the productive work and the reproductive work, and be kind of this kind of strong figures. That was something that came up in the interviews after when I was talking to people. You know, this idea of we were working for the factory, we were working for the future generations, and also before we were able to combine, you know, productive and reproductive work, and now we are not expected to have any I have to say, any free time. Nobody cares if we have a sick relative or if we have a sick child at home. Our boss doesn't care. Our boss doesn't give us time to be at home and to do what we should be doing in terms of our domestic duties. So this idea that, you know, this compression of the buffer between productive and reproductive work, that was something that came up, and that was definitely connected to the structural feeling, on the feeling that your employer should understand if you have certain pressing domestic tasks that are waiting at home, and shouldn't think of you just as this kind of neutral male individual. You know, the fact that the factory was somehow accommodating the position of women as workers and mothers at the same time. That was something that definitely came up in that structural feeling, but it's not easy to define, definitely.
Thanks.
Tiana, you had a question.
Yes, thank you so very much, Chiara, for this wonderful lecture, which is actually quite close to home, because the very last, say, country that I left before coming to the Netherlands was Yugoslavia. And I wonder if you ever investigated into, say, pre-World War Yugoslavia gender equality issues, because what I've personally been always interested in is how it was so easy to transition into this socialist, say, conditions in which women had equal rights, at least on paper, to men.
Mm. What do you mean? Like in the interwar period, I mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was easy in which way? What do you, in terms of?
I mean, I don't know. I know that, for instance, my family situation is such that I am from a very strong matriarch family, because I'm the third university-educated generation of women. My grandmother held a double degree, and her sister was a captain of industry. She was the CEO of electronic industry of Yugoslavia in the south of Serbia, more specifically. And I always wondered if someone could just answer that question. I mean, when I came to the Netherlands, it turned out that actually rights of women and their prospects were quite different than what I was used to. So I was just wondering, how do you explain this
Yeah,
phenomenon.
There's definitely were already some interesting role models in the interwar period as well. And I think it's this generation that was educated and urban in the interwar period that kind of joined the Communist Party shortly before the war, and then they sort of shaped the program for the socialist period. And these were the lawyers, the doctors, the people who were there in let's say educated in the 30s, and in the 40s they came to power after the partisan won the war, and then they started to implement this kind of program. And this program was as you say, like this how to say, the nuclear family in the interwar period was perhaps the ideal that was then transposed during socialism to all these rural places in Yugoslavia where people were illiterate or working in the countryside. And so there was this strong paternalistic or maternalistic endeavor on the part of the educated female elite to educate kind of the masses of women, and that's something I work a lot on in my research. It's this idea of how to emancipate, like this idea of emancipation within your own country. So how do you emancipate the masses within your own country? And definitely there was this kind of continuity with the educated elite from the interwar.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions for Chiara? I myself, Chiara, I was very much intrigued also by what you were saying about how global capitalism is denying the meaning of work in people's lives. So I was also, and it adds a little bit to what has been said in the previous questions, but I was also curious to know how you are contributing to a theory of labor as such, as a signifying practice in people's life, and how this might also be deployed as a critique, both on socialism and on capitalist deployments of the concept of work, or the practices also.
Yeah, thank you.
That could be a feminist intervention, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, one of the fields I'm engaging with is this field of let's say gender studies related to Central and Eastern Europe, and there's been quite a bit written in the early 90s and 2000s. And one of the argument was that women were exploited during socialism, and they were experiencing this double burden, and so they were kind of happy to go back to the home. And what I'm saying in my work is that not all of them were happy to go back to the home, and some of them would have liked to keep certain possibilities of work and labor that they had created during the socialist era. And I think that's the intervention, that it's maybe very much related to the local debate or the kind of regional debate, but it's about seeing working class women as having agency and not just being this exploited victims of state patriarchy or the double burden. This, I think, is the kind of intervention I'm trying to do in the book. And of course, it builds into a larger theory of labor for the whole socialist period. There's been quite a bit of there's been a revival of studies into class and labor for socialism, because for a long time, especially in the former Yugoslavia, the ethnicity was the main lens through which things were read. But now there's much more done on class and labor. So that's definitely a whole conversation, and I think the important thing is also to have an intersection of gender and labor history, and not just to look at gender in separation from labor, or look at labor in separation from gender, but to really look at things more intersectionally there.
But what I was also struck by what one of your interviewees was saying, that work provided the opportunity to organize themselves, so they and to be a community. So they were singing and laughing. So that's very much how I also, what made me think while listening to you, that being sent at home, I mean, one of the main things mothers are suffering from is solitude, and having no context and so forth. So I've all of a sudden I saw quite of a nice feminist topic there, or how preventing women from work is, I don't want to think in terms of complots, but it seems to be very suiting to patriarchal thought and to prevent women from becoming a political entity, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the arguments that I make in the book is that this whole debate about the retraditionalization of gender relations after 1989 is not just related to ideology and nationalism, but is also related to this social and economic disempowerment of women. So, yeah. You know, it's I think we need to look at things not just from a discursive perspective, but also from a material perspective, to what extent the ending of such spaces at the economic and social level is also fostering retraditionalization of gender relations, and especially a reliance on the family, because many of these women, as I was a bit fast on this issue of survival after the closure of the factory, but many of these women then had to rely on kinship networks and extended family networks and informal structures rather than on this factory, which made them also more susceptible to be dependent from the family. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And one interesting thing that comes up in some of the interviews is that these women, when they started working for the factory, they were young women. Many of them, they were not highly educated. Many of them came from the countryside, and they were like, I got my first wage, and then I could do whatever I wanted. I was 18, I got my first wage. I was, finally feeling like a citizenship, like a citizen, a productive member of society, that I could do whatever I want with myself. So that's something that really was very important for a number of women, this economic emancipation, and perhaps don't think about it anymore so much, but it's very...
An agency.
An agency, yeah.
And self-definement. Okay, if there is no further urge to raise questions, I'm absolutely sure that we are nourished with quite some things to think about. I would conclude and thanking you very much. Maybe we can all turn on our screens and
thank you so much.
And of course, you all buy and, more importantly, read Chiara's beautiful book, which wealth of
paperback, so it's affordable finally.
Affordable for everybody. See you all soon again in the same context or in other contexts. Take care.
Take care.
And lovely to have you had with us, Chiara.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Take care. Bye-bye. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.